The first thing Cadet Ren Vaskar noticed about the Victhari Instructor was that it never blinked. That was the tell. Every species blinked. It was practically a universal constant of biology, some reflex born of the need to keep sensitive optical organs moist and clear. The Victhari didn't need to. Their compound lenses were self-cleaning, self-lubricating, protected by a transparent carapace that never fogged, never dried, never faltered. They watched you the way predators watch prey across a treeless plain with total, unblinking patience. Instructor Velkin stood at the front of the cavernous training bay on Outpost Tharsis 7, a converted asteroid facility orbiting above the red dust of what used to be called Mars. The room smelled of ozone and coolant and the faint, sweet rot that all Victhari seemed to carry in their exoskeleton glands. 40 cadets sat at long steel tables. 36 of them were human. 4 were not. Today's practical assessment, Velkin said, in the clipped and mechanical galactic standard it always used, is weapons fabrication under field conditions. Its voice had no warmth. It was not built for warmth. The Victhari had evolved on a world with 40-hour days and acid rain seasons that lasted for decades. Their concept of comfort was surviving until the acid season ended. You will use only materials available within this room. You will construct a functional ranged weapon. You have 4 of your hours. Begin. The room moved. Cadets went immediately for the equipment caches, coils of monofilament wire, lengths of composite piping, pressurized gas canisters, sheets of polymer flex, circuit boards stripped from decommissioned drones. It was a well-stocked trash pile, deliberately curated so that an intelligent being with the right training could build something capable of doing damage. The Victhari curriculum prized ingenuity. Velkin would have called it the highest virtue if it understood virtue. Ren Vaskar sat still for 11 seconds. Around him, his fellow cadets moved with the frantic energy of people who feared failure, who already had designs in their heads and were racing their own anxiety to the finish. He watched them. Idri, the Korathi cadet 3 seats down, was already disassembling a pressurized gas canister with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before. His 4 dexterous arms moved in overlapping sequence like a machine, predictable, effective. Whatever he built would work perfectly, be exactly within spec, and impress nobody. Ren reached into the equipment pile without standing up and pulled out 3 things. A length of flexible polymer tubing about 30 centimeters long, a coil of braided cable, and a small Y-shaped junction piece from a ventilation manifold. He set them on the table in front of him and looked at them. He thought about his grandmother. She had lived in the hill country outside what used to be called Lahore, on a patch of land that had been in the family for 6 generations before the Victhari arrived and the world changed. She had not been a remarkable woman by any metric the Victhari would recognize. She could not calculate firing trajectories. She could not bench press a loaded cargo sled. She had never fired a plasma weapon in her life. But she had a strip of leather and a pouch of smooth creek stones, and on slow evenings she would set tin cans on a fence post 50 meters away and knock them down one by one, humming to herself, not looking at the stones, just humming. Ren's father had asked her once where she learned to do that. She said, from her father, who learned it from his father, who got it from God only knows how far back. A piece of knowledge so old it predated writing. It crossed the boundary between animal and human so far back that it probably had no name when it was invented. He picked up the Y-junction and the cable and started working. The 4 hours passed in a way Ren barely noticed. There was a particular quality to the time when he was working on something with his hands, a narrowing of the world to the space between his palms, a quieting of the background noise of anxiety and ambition that filled every waking moment at Tharsis 7. He stripped the braided cable to its core strands and selected the 3 most elastic. He knotted them in a pattern he had tested 100 times in his bunk with spare cord, a double looping harness knot that distributed tension evenly across both anchor points. He cut the polymer tubing to length and shaped the pouch with the flat of his thumbnail. He tested the draw weight with his fingers, feeling for the sweet spot, that precise moment where stored energy peaked before diminishing return set in. Around him, his fellow cadets built elaborate things. Bogard Temis assembled a compressed air launcher from the canister and piping that looked genuinely dangerous, a meter of polished tube with a trigger mechanism made from stripped circuit components, and the spring from a seat clasp. Idri had constructed something multi-barreled, a rotating assembly that could theoretically fire 3 projectiles in sequence. Even the quietest cadet in the room, a young woman named Priya who rarely spoke, had built a taut crossbow-shaped device from polymer sheets and monofilament. Ren's finished device sat on the table in front of him. It was not impressive. The Y-junction formed the frame. The elastic cable strands ran between the 2 prongs, knotted so cleanly that the construction itself was the only evidence of craft. The pouch was a folded rectangle of polymer, held by the strands with slipknots that distributed the load. It fit in one hand. It weighed almost nothing. It was a slingshot. Not a rail slingshot, not a magnetic assist slingshot, not any of the hyphenated, augmented, technologically improved variants that appeared in supplementary equipment catalogs. A slingshot, an instrument unchanged in any essential way from what children had made in every culture on Earth since before recorded history. What his grandmother had made. What her father had made, and his father before him, back and back along a chain of human ingenuity that stretched into a past so deep it had no documented floor. Velkin walked the room. Its footfalls were precise and even, a rhythm like a metronome. It stopped at each table and observed without comment. When it reached Ren's table it paused. The compound eyes swept down to the slingshot and held there for 3 seconds. Then it moved on. Ren picked up the slingshot and a smooth steel ball bearing he had pocketed from the equipment pile. Ball bearings always ended up in equipment piles. They fell out of everything, and he waited. The assessment bell rang. "Weapons demonstration will now commence," Velkin announced. "Each cadet will demonstrate function. Range must exceed 20 meters. Target acquisition must be demonstrable." They hung targets at the far end of the bay, simple polymer panels marked with concentric rings, the alien equivalent of a bullseye. The distance was marked, 22 meters. Cadets lined up in the order their names had been assigned at enrollment. Ren was 9th. Temis went first. Her compressed air launcher fired a metal slug that punched clean through the target panel and embedded itself in the wall beyond. The room produced a sound of impressed breath. Velkin noted something on its data slate. The cadets before Ren all produced weapons that worked. Some were elegant, some crude, all functional. When Idri fired his rotating launcher, the 3 projectiles went in a spread pattern that covered a full quarter of the panel. The room stirred again. Then it was Ren's turn. He walked to the mark. He held the slingshot at his side. He could feel the eyes, 40 cadets, Velkin's unblinking compound pair, the surveillance cameras in each corner of the bay that fed back to Victhari command infrastructure. The room was silent in the way rooms go silent when they expect spectacle or failure, and cannot yet tell which. He placed the ball bearing in the pouch. He did not rush. He drew the strands back slowly, feeling the tension build, not fighting it, working with it, letting the elastic do what elastic wanted to do, channeling rather than forcing. His elbow dropped slightly. His breathing slowed. He thought about tin cans on a fence post. He thought about an old woman humming to herself. He released. The ball bearing crossed 22 meters in something under a tenth of a second. It struck the target panel in the inner ring, 2 centimeters from center, and left a clean dent the diameter of a coin. The room was quiet for a moment, longer than normal. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone laughed. Not a mean laugh, a startled one. The sound of a person who has just been surprised by something they didn't expect to find funny and finds they can't help themselves. Velkin walked to the target and examined the dent. It stood there for 4 seconds. Then it turned. Effective, it said, which was the highest compliment the Victhari curriculum allowed. Ren walked back to his table and sat down. He did not smile. He turned the slingshot over in his hands and thought about his grandmother. 3 weeks later, the situation at Tharsis 7 changed. It changed the way most situations changed in those years after the Compact of Silence. Not with a declaration, not with a speech, but with a sound. In this case, the sound was the alarm klaxon that ran through the whole station at 3:40 local, a sound like metal being torn, followed by the emergency lighting switching to red. Ren was awake before the alarm finished its first cycle. He dressed in the dark without thinking about it, a habit built over 18 months of early morning drills, his hands finding each piece of gear by texture and weight. Boots, pressure suit liner, cadet comm unit. He was in the corridor outside his bunk before half the room had opened their eyes. The hallway was already dense with bodies, cadets moving in every direction, most of them half-dressed, some of them carrying equipment they had grabbed without thinking. The Victhari staff moved through them in the opposite direction, toward the command hub, with the focused economy of movement that characterized their species under pressure. Something was very wrong. Ren did not move toward the command hub. He moved toward the training bay. This was not an obvious decision, and he could not have explained it in formal language if pressed. It was something more like a feeling, the particular instinct that comes from spending your life as someone who isn't the biggest or the fastest or the strongest in the room, and who has therefore learned to look for the thing nobody else is looking for. He pushed against the flow of bodies, ducked through a maintenance access hatch, and took the service corridor that ran behind the training bay. It smelled of recycled air and electrical insulation. The red emergency lighting made everything look like the inside of a wound. What he found when he reached the training bay observation window made his stomach drop. Outside, through the station's reinforced viewport, he could see 3 Victhari military vessels holding position in the dark. They were not the diplomatic transport ships he was used to seeing in the docking ring. These were knife-shaped, black-hull assault cruisers, the kind that had been used in the Phobos pacification and the Ganymede reduction, and half a dozen other events that the official curriculum called stabilization operations, and that the cadets, in the dark of their bunks, called something else. Standing in the training bay, surrounded by the equipment caches and the target panels and the scattered remains of last week's fabrication project, were 7 armed Victhari soldiers. They had their weapons out. The weapons were trained on the bay entrance. In the center of the room, on his knees with his hands clasped behind his head, was Commander Harath. Commander Harath was the human officer assigned to Tharsis 7, the highest-ranking human in the facility, the one person in the whole station who the Victhari High Command treated as a peer rather than a subordinate. He was 63 years old, a lean and weathered man who had survived 2 wars and a decade of interspecies diplomacy, and who had the particular kind of dignity that comes not from never being knocked down, but from being knocked down so many times that getting up again no longer required a decision. He was on his knees now. His expression was calm. One of the Victhari soldiers was speaking to him in Vok. Ren's Vok was poor. He had 2 semesters of it and retained perhaps 400 words, but he caught the shape of the exchange. The word for hostage appeared twice. The word for compliance appeared once. The word that translated most closely as demonstration appeared 3 times. They were going to make an example. Ren understood this with the part of his brain that did not panic. The Victhari High Command had been growing impatient with the human contingent at Tharsis 7. He had heard this in fragments for months, from a conversation between 2 Victhari junior staff he had overheard in the cafeteria, from the careful silences of his non-human classmates when certain topics arose, from the way Commander Harath had looked, in recent weeks, like a man carrying a weight that he refused to put down, but that was slowly costing him height. Someone in the high command had decided that the training program needed a reset, that the humans needed to be reminded of the terms of the compact. That visible force, applied to the most visible human authority figure on the station, would serve as that reminder. The slingshot was in his pocket. He had been carrying it for 3 weeks. Not deliberately, it had started as a habit of the hands, the same way you pocket a coin or a smooth stone and keep finding it there at odd moments. But it was there. The Y-junction, the elastic strands, the pouch. It fit between his thumb and forefinger. It weighed nothing. He looked around him. The observation window was reinforced polymer, the same material the target panels in the bay were made of. It was not airtight. This was a service corridor with maintenance access, and the ventilation panels at the base of the observation window drew air from both sides. Through the lower ventilation panel, he could see directly into the bay at floor level, which meant the sightline was clear, which meant the angle was good, which meant the distance to the command drone that hovered in the far corner of the bay, the one with the transmission array, the one that was broadcasting this entire scene back to whoever in the Victhari military chain of command needed to see it, was approximately 18 meters. He had been hitting targets at 22 meters for 3 weeks. He looked at the drone. He looked at the transmission array on its underside, a small hexagonal cluster of components that he recognized from the equipment catalogs he had studied, because the Victhari curriculum required comprehensive equipment catalog study, and Ren had always studied comprehensively. The array was not armored. It was designed for transmission, not combat. It was the kind of component you did not armor because you did not expect it to need armoring, because who was going to throw something at a command drone in the middle of a controlled operation? Because that was not how anyone fought, because it was not rational, because it was not in any tactical doctrine that any sophisticated military intelligence would model. Ren reached into his pocket and found the ball bearing. He undid the ventilation panel latch with one hand, a simple quarter-turn mechanism, and slid it aside until the opening was just wide enough for his arm. The air from the bay tasted of ozone and the sweet rot of Victhari glands. He did not let himself think about what happened if this went wrong. He did not let himself think about what happened if it went right. He thought about the transmission array. He thought about the elastic. He thought about tin cans. He put the ball bearing in the pouch. He fed his arm through the gap until his elbow was braced against the ventilation frame. He felt the frame vibrate slightly with the ventilation cycling, not enough to matter, but he adjusted his angle anyway, small correction. The way you correct for wind without thinking about it. The way you learn to correct for anything by doing it enough times until it stops being a calculation and becomes a feeling. He drew back. In the bay, the Victhari soldier was speaking again. Commander Harath's hands were still clasped. His expression was still calm, but Ren could see the muscle working in his jaw. The one tell the old man had that meant he was holding something together by force of will. Ren released. The ball bearing went through the ventilation gap and crossed the bay in a fraction of a second and hit the transmission array dead center. The array made a sound like a cricket being stepped on, a small, sharp, entirely final sound, and the command drone's running lights flickered once and went dark. The broadcast signal died. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then every Victhari soldier in the room turned toward the source of the sound. The moment they turned, Commander Harath moved. He was 63 years old, and he had been on his knees on a hard floor for 7 minutes, and he moved with a speed and violence that Ren had not anticipated from watching him carry a weight across lecture halls for the past 18 months. He drove his shoulder into the nearest soldier's midsection with the kind of commitment that comes from deciding that whatever happens next, you are not going to be found sitting still when it does. The soldier went sideways. Its weapon discharged into the ceiling. The detonation was loud enough to be felt in the chest. Ren was already moving. He hit the maintenance hatch at a run, fell into the corridor, ran the 12 meters to the nearest emergency equipment locker. All Tharsis 7 corridors had emergency equipment lockers. The Victhari had designed the station with them and stocked them with tools for damage control, and found what he was looking for in the third compartment from the left. A set of magnetic tethers used for EVA operations, strong enough to hold a suited human against the exterior of a moving vessel. He ran back toward the training bay. The sounds from inside had changed. The controlled silence had become controlled chaos, the specific chaos of a space where multiple armed beings are trying to dominate a situation that has stopped being controlled. He could hear Commander Hareth's voice giving short, flat orders that suggested he had gotten a weapon from somewhere. He could hear the Victhari soldiers responding in Vok, rapid short bursts that were not commands but reactions. He hit the bay door with his shoulder and jammed a magnetic tether through the closing mechanism so it could not seal. The scene inside was not the scene he had left. 2 of the 7 soldiers were down, not dead, but incapacitated, pinned under emergency containment netting that Commander Hareth had apparently triggered from a wall panel in the 2 seconds Ren had been gone. Hareth himself was behind an overturned equipment table, holding a Victhari sidearm pointed at the remaining 5 soldiers with the focused calm of a man who had pointed firearms at frightening things before, and understood that the focused calm was itself a weapon. "Vaskar," Hareth said without looking at him, "glad you could join us. Please do not do anything that makes this situation more complicated." "Yes, sir," Ren said. "Do you know what you just did?" "I disrupted their broadcast, sir." "You disrupted their broadcast," Hareth said. "Do you know why that matters?" "Because without a verified broadcast of the demonstration, there's no demonstrable incident for the High Command to build a case around." Hareth said nothing for a moment. The 5 standing Victhari soldiers were still, in the way that highly trained beings go still when they are recalculating. This was the Victhari equivalent of confusion, not panic, but a pause, a reprocessing, the moment between input and output when the expected parameters have changed enough that the system needs to find new ones. "Technically correct," Hareth said, "dangerously simplistic, but in the present context, technically correct is enough." He raised his voice toward the Victhari soldiers and switched to formal galactic standard, the kind you used in official communications, the kind that showed up verbatim in records. "This engagement is now a matter of disputed record. No verified broadcast of incident was completed. Under Compact Article 19, any unverified incident is subject to full review before action. I am invoking Article 19. I am requesting the immediate presence of the facility adjudicator." The senior Victhari soldier, Ren could tell it was senior by the width of its thorax plating and the triple-banded marking on its weapon arm, did not respond immediately. It was running calculations. It was a creature of exquisite military training and superb tactical instinct, and all of that training and instinct was encountering something it had not modeled. The situation had gone, in the space of 3 minutes, from a controlled demonstration with full broadcast documentation to an unverified incident with live witnesses, an invoked Article 19, and a human officer holding a Victhari weapon in a facility that was not, technically, Victhari sovereign territory. The math had changed. "Stand down," the senior soldier said, in galactic standard. It lowered its own weapon by 3 degrees, not fully, but 3 degrees, which in Victhari body language was the equivalent of taking a step back. "Adjudicator request acknowledged." Ren sat down on the floor of the training bay and discovered that his hands were shaking. He had not noticed until now. The body had been doing its job, heart rate elevated, respiration fast and shallow, hands steady with the specific borrowed steadiness that adrenaline provides, and now that the immediate moment of decision had passed, The body was reclaiming what the adrenaline had borrowed. He looked at the slingshot in his hand and thought about his grandmother. He thought she would have thought this was funny. The adjudication took 11 days. During those 11 days, Ren was not in custody. The Victhari could not formally detain him under Article 19, while the review was in progress without creating a secondary incident that would require its own review. But he was on restricted movement, confined to the residential section of Tharsis 7, allowed in the cafeteria and the exercise corridor and nowhere else. He used the time to study. This surprised him slightly. He had expected to spend the 11 days in something like suspense, in the grinding anxiety of a person waiting for a verdict that would determine the rest of their life. And there was some of that. But mostly, there was a quality of clarity he had not had before, the peculiar mental sharpness of someone who has already done the thing they were afraid of and found that they survived it. The studying felt real in a way that it hadn't before. The Victhari equipment catalogs felt useful. The compact articles felt urgent. He read everything he was allowed to access and several things he was not, accessed via a secondary terminal in the exercise corridor that had not been locked because nobody had thought it needed locking, because that was not in any security protocol, because who studied weapons catalogs in an unlocked exercise terminal. On the third day of adjudication, Instructor Velkin appeared in the residential section doorway. Ren was reading. He looked up. Velkin stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Its compound eyes swept the room. Then it entered and sat, an awkward motion, because Victhari were not built for human chair geometry, across from Ren at the communal table. "You used the object you built in the fabrication assessment," it said. "Yes, Instructor." "You did not tell anyone you intended to use it." "I didn't know I intended to use it until I used it." Velkin processed this for a moment. The sweet rot smell was there, close up, like something fermented and ancient. "That is not tactically sound reasoning," it said. "No, Instructor. Tactically sound reasoning requires advanced planning, contingency mapping, scenario modeling." "Yes, Instructor." "What you did," Velkin said, "was not tactically sound." It paused. It was effective. It said the word in the same flat tone it had used in the training bay 3 weeks ago, a tone completely empty of inflection, which for the Victhari was as close as they came to deliberate emphasis. The distinction matters. Tactical soundness can be trained. Effectiveness under unmodeled conditions cannot. Ren waited. "You disrupted a superior force using a pre-industrial tool," Velkin said. "The probability modeling for that outcome was not accounted for in any scenario the operation planners used." "Because it's not in any tactical doctrine," Ren said. "Because it is not rational," Velkin said. "By any measurable metric, the use of an elastic projectile device against a command drone in an active military operation is not rational." "It worked." "Yes," Velkin said, "it worked." The compound eyes held steady on his face. "The Victhari have been studying your species for 22 years. We have comprehensive biological, psychological, and historical profiles. We have modeled your decision matrices in 11,000 simulated scenarios." A pause. "We did not model the slingshot." Ren said nothing. "We did not model it," Velkin repeated, "because it is not a rational weapon choice in any scenario our models generate. The elastic velocity is insufficient for significant damage against standard military hardware. The accuracy is dependent on a manual skill that requires years of practice and cannot be reliably standardized. The ammunition is improvised and inconsistent." Another pause, longer this time. "We did not consider that someone would have spent years practicing it anyway. We did not consider the grandmother." Ren looked at the instructor. "Commander Harath's debrief included your statement about the origin of the skill," Velkin said. "We reviewed the cultural record. The sling and slingshot appear in the oldest documented combat records of your species, older than writing, older than agriculture. The skill predates every metric by which we categorize the development of military capacity. Its voice had not changed, but something in the quality of its stillness had a very slight shift, the way a body shifts when it is settling into a new position after discovering the old one was less comfortable than it thought. We have been modeling your current capabilities. We did not model your memory. The adjudication concluded 4 days later, on the 8th day of 11. The verdict was contained in a compact Article 19 review finding, filed under Tharsis 7 Incident Case, number 7741AA. And it was the kind of document that seemed thin for everything it contained, 12 pages of formal galactic standard, dense with procedural language, but carrying in its passive diplomatic constructions the weight of a door that had been closed from the outside and was now open from the inside. The planned demonstration was found to have been initiated without compact authorization. The human officer's invocation of Article 19 was upheld. The detaining of Victhari military assets on non-sovereign facility grounds was found to be a protocol violation. 3 Victhari military officers were returned to their chain of command for review. The assault cruisers withdrew from holding position around Tharsis 7 within 6 hours of the finding. Commander Hareth called Wren to his office on the 9th day. The office was small and utilitarian, the kind of space that a man earns rather than receives, nothing on the walls except a system map, and a framed photograph of a coastline that Wren did not recognize, a desk with a visible water ring from a cup used in the same spot every morning, a chair that had been sat in long enough to know the shape of its occupant. Hareth was behind the desk. He looked like he had not slept well in 11 days, which seemed correct, because he probably had not. "Sit down," Hareth said. Wren sat. "I'm going to tell you something that I probably should not tell you," Hareth said, "because you are a cadet and cadets do not receive the kind of information I am about to give you, and because once you have it you cannot unknow it, and knowing it is going to change how you think about every assignment you receive for the rest of your career." He looked at the desk for a moment, then back up. "Do you want to know?" "Yes, sir," Wren said. "The operation 3 days ago was not a surprise. We knew something like it was coming for 4 months. The High Command has been pushing for a new terms review of the compact, and they have been building a case. Visible compliance failures on our side, corrected by visible Victhari force, broadcast back to their population as evidence that their position is justified and their methods are necessary." He paused. "We had a counterplan. It was careful and it was good, and it involved several months of diplomatic work and 3 allied species who were prepared to file joint censure motions in the event of an unauthorized demonstration." "What happened to it?" Wren said. "You happened to it," Hareth said. He did not say this unkindly. "When you disrupted the broadcast, you did not just neutralize the immediate threat. You took the demonstration out of the Victhari's evidence file. There is no recording. There are 7 Victhari soldiers who were present and can testify to what happened, but testimony without documentation carries 1/3 the weight in compact proceedings, and all 7 of them are currently under internal review for an unauthorized operation on a non-sovereign facility, which makes their testimony even less useful to the High Command's case." He looked at his hands. "You destroyed a case that took 4 months to build in about 1/10 of a second." Wren waited. "You also," Hareth said, "nearly got us both killed, and possibly started a war." He picked up the framed photograph from the corner of the desk and looked at it, and Wren realized he did this the way some people rubbed a smooth stone, not looking at it, just feeling the fact of it. "I'm going to recommend you for advanced certification in covert operations, not because what you did was smart. It was not smart. It was the opposite of smart. It was a pre-industrial manual skill used against a military drone in an active hostile operation, and the probability of success was approximately 7%. He set the photograph down. But you had a 7% solution and you used it. Most people don't use 7% solutions. Most people look for something with better odds, and when they don't find it, they freeze. You did not freeze. My grandmother didn't freeze, Ren said. Hareth looked at him. Something moved in the older man's face, not quite a smile, but the shape a face makes when it is remembering something that smiles cost. No, he said. I suppose she didn't. The certification training was on a station Ren had not heard of before, in a sector of the system that did not appear on any navigation chart available to cadets, accessed via transport that ran without transponder signal, and whose crew did not speak during the 6-day journey there. It was the kind of place that existed because there were things that needed to happen that could not happen in the places on official charts. There were 11 humans in his cohort. He was the youngest by 7 years. They came from backgrounds that had one thing in common. They had all, at some point, used something that was not supposed to work. There was Myra, who had stopped a Victhari surveillance sweep with a hand mirror, and a knowledge of how Victhari compound eyes processed reflected light. There was Devraj, who had talked a Victhari tribunal into a procedural delay by invoking an obscure subclause of the Compact's predecessor agreement that had not been cited in any official proceeding in 11 years, and that Devraj had found in a footnote of an archived diplomatic correspondence. There was Sung Jin, who had disabled a Victhari security perimeter by feeding false readings into its sensor array, with a device made from spare broadcast components, and the speaker coil from a personal audio unit. They were all, Ren came to understand, people who had looked at a situation with insufficient tools and had not asked for better tools. They had used what was in their pockets. The training itself was not what he expected. He had expected weapons. He had expected intensive tactical instruction, scenario drills, the kind of hard-edged curriculum that would build on what he already knew and sharpen it into something more specifically dangerous. There was some of that, but mostly the training was history. Human history. Not the history in the official curriculum, not the sanitized, forward-looking timeline of technological development and diplomatic achievement that the Victhari curriculum presented as the record of a species being brought along toward standards. The actual history. The messy, redundant, catastrophically non-linear record of what humans had done when they were afraid, when they were trapped, when they had nothing left to use but what they remembered from their mothers and their fathers, and the long chain of generations that stretched back to the first frightened thing that picked up a stone and understood that it had made a choice. They studied the wars, all of them, every improvised weapon, every unexpected tactic, every moment in which a force with a technological disadvantage had refused to behave in the way that force with a technological advantage predicted. The pike against the cavalry charge, the rifled musket against the smoothbore. The asymmetric resistance that took occupiers who came with superior firepower, and found that superior firepower was not the thing the occupation was vulnerable to. They studied the slingshot, specifically David and Goliath, the Balearic slingers of Carthage, the Andean Huaraca, the Irish Taborin, the boys in every occupied city in every century who had figured out that a stone and a strip of leather could reach further than a fist. They studied the grandmother, although they called her by different names in different lessons. At the end of the training, there was a final assessment, and the final assessment was not a weapons fabrication exercise. The assessment was a room. Just a room with a sealed door. Inside the room was a Victhari military-grade security lock, the kind that sealed the access corridors on the assault cruisers. Also inside the room was a table with a pile of materials, a coil of wire, a small optical prism, a circuit board from a cadet communication unit, a length of fiber optic cable, a piece of metal folded into a crude triangle, and a small length of flexible polymer tubing. On the wall above the door was a display that showed a countdown, 40 minutes. Ren sat in the room alone, and looked at the materials for 30 seconds. Then he picked up the optical prism and the fiber optic cable and started working. He had the door open in 26 minutes. The officer waiting on the other side was a woman he had not met during the training. She was tall, with a particular kind of stillness that indicated someone who had spent years in situations where moving carelessly had serious consequences. She looked at him, then at the door, then back at him. 26 minutes, she said. Yes, ma'am. The record is 21. I'll do better. Yes, she said, you will. She handed him a data chip the size of a thumbnail. Welcome to the program. He did not ask which program. He would learn what he needed to learn when he needed to learn it, and what he needed to know now was that the door was open and the countdown had not reached 0. He put the data chip in his pocket alongside the slingshot, still there, still the same Y-junction and braided cable strands, and he followed the officer down the corridor. 6 months later, Ren Vaskar was on a Victhari station he was not supposed to be on, and the door he needed to open was not a training exercise. The station was called Velmarin 4, and it was the communications hub for the Victhari administrative sector that covered the inner system. Everything moving between the High Command and their assets in the inner worlds went through Velmarin 4. Every order, every update, every case file that the High Command was building for the new terms review of the compact. Destroy the hub's primary relay array, and the case files were gone. Months of documentation dissolved into static. The whole carefully constructed legal and diplomatic case for tightening the terms of the compact reduced to the word of Victhari officers who had, as of 3 days ago, themselves been placed under internal review for a separate incident. The timing was not a coincidence. He had helped make it not a coincidence. He had been in the station for 11 hours, moving through maintenance corridors, dressed in a deep maintenance environment suit he had acquired, through a process that he preferred not to catalog even in his own thinking, 2 days before his insertion. The suit was Victhari manufacture. The smells it carried, carefully prepared, were Victhari olfactory markers. The Victhari relied on olfactory identification more than visual. Their compound eyes were extraordinary for tracking motion and processing wide-field information, but for individual identification at close range, scent was primary. Nobody had looked at him twice in 11 hours. The relay array was in the core of the station, in a hardened compartment that required 3 separate security clearances to enter, each clearance checked by a different system, each system running on a different protocol. The direct route was not accessible. The maintenance corridor behind the relay compartment was. He was in the corridor now, looking through a ventilation panel at the relay array. It was larger than the command drone he had hit at Tharsis 7, much larger, a full 3 meters across, bristling with transmission components and cooling infrastructure, embedded in the station's superstructure in a way that suggested the people who designed it had thought carefully about protecting it from everything except a maintenance approach from the back wall, because that was not in any tactical doctrine, because that was not how anyone fought, because. He reached into the pocket of the environment suit and found the slingshot. The materials available in a maintenance corridor were not the same as the materials available in a fabrication exercise, but they were not nothing. The station's gravity was lighter than Earth standard, which affected the arc. The ventilation gap was wider here, a full hand width, which helped. The distance to the primary transmission node of the relay array was 14 meters. At 14 meters, with a steel fastener that he had removed from the ventilation panel casing itself, the margin for error was negligible. He had been hitting targets at 22 meters for 2 years. He loaded the fastener. He braced his elbow against the ventilation frame. He felt the draw, the tension, the sweet spot where stored energy peaked, and the question was no longer whether to release but when. He thought about the training room and the history lessons. He thought about Myra and her hand mirror, Devraj and his footnote of a footnote, Sung Jin and his speaker coil. He thought about 11 humans in a secret station in a sector that wasn't on any chart, all of them people who had looked at a situation with insufficient tools and had not asked for better tools. He thought about his grandmother, sitting on the porch in the evening light, tin cans on a fence post 50 meters away, not looking at the stones, just humming. He released. The fastener crossed 14 meters and struck the primary transmission node of the relay array. The node was not armored. It was designed for transmission, not combat. It was the kind of component you did not armor because you did not expect anyone to reach it this way, because that was not rational, because it was not in any model. The relay array did not go dark immediately. It cycled 3 seconds of flickering, of systems trying to reroute around the damaged node, of backup protocols engaging and finding nothing to back up to, and then it went quiet. Not the dramatic silence of an explosion, not the visible catastrophe of a burning structure. Just a machine that had been transmitting and was now not transmitting, with no obvious external damage, no blast signature, no forensic evidence of deliberate action. Just a very small dent in a very important piece of equipment. The station's general systems did not register it as a hostile act. The station's security systems did not register it as anything. The maintenance corridor logs would show a deep maintenance suit in the sector, which was normal, because deep maintenance suits belonged in maintenance corridors. By the time any Victhari technician reached the relay array, Ren would be 2 sections over, resealing a ventilation panel, heading toward the insertion point in the docking ring with the unhurried pace of a being who had nothing to hide. By the time the high command realized what had gone quiet, it would be too late to recover the files that had been in transit. He sealed the ventilation panel. He put the slingshot back in his pocket. He walked. The station hummed around him, the deep, constant vibration of a massive structure in space, its systems cycling, its inhabitants going about their work unaware. Above him, through layers of superstructure and hull plating, and the cold nothing of deep space, the assault cruisers sat in their docking berths, full of soldiers who had trained for every kind of conflict their intelligence services could model. None of them had modeled this. He thought about that, about the gap between what a sophisticated intelligence could model and what an old woman on a porch in the hills could do without thinking about it. About the chain of memory that ran from her hands to his, through every generation of people who had looked at what they had and found it sufficient. About the grandmother that the Victhari had not accounted for, the one they couldn't put in their models because she lived in a part of human history they had studied as archaeology rather than doctrine. They had the ships, they had the weapons, they had 22 years of comprehensive biological, psychological, and historical profiles. They did not have 11,000 years of figuring out how to make do. He rounded the corner into the docking section and walked toward his exit point with his hands in his pockets, and the slingshot was there, Y-junction and elastic strands and the pouch that fit between his thumb and forefinger, the whole weight of it less than a handful of air. The door at the end of the corridor opened when he reached it, which was the way doors always opened when you had 14 meters of clear sightline and something in your pocket and no intention of freezing. He walked out,